Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Cryptozoology. Today's topic is somewhat of a complex one because we're going to be delving into a very complex notion, a very complex subject, which is that of eyewitness testimony, considering especially the nature of the validity that can be found in eyewitness testimony. This is a case that has kind of everything about that rolled into one. It has what the events leading up to an eyewitness testimony can mean for eyewitness testimony. It has factors of the environment considered in it as well. And perhaps most importantly in relation to both of those, it contextualizes the nature of consequence for an eyewitness testimony. The real cherry on top of all of this is that today's topic will be found with one of the stranger cases of cryptozoology, the lizard man sightings of Bishopville, South Carolina. The lizard man of Bishopville, South Carolina isn't a cryptid with a significant amount of reports, at least not in comparison to other cryptid sightings that are more mainstream, like Sasquatch. However, what makes the sighting significant is the very nature of them. A lizard man is, of course, a very strange thing to describe. And the description tended to be that people were, in fact, reporting seeing this large humanoid figure that tended, in many cases, to be green in coloration. It should be noted that some reports don't describe the consistency of the skin on this subject, which has led to many theories to the identity, if there is such thing as the lizard man, one of which being a moss-covered Sasquatch. And this theory actually does kind of tie into today's topic because we're going to be talking about Chris Davis. Chris Davis was a key player in the lizard man case and remained so even 11 years after his death. Without further ado, I will be going into Chris Davis's hand in the lizard man case and what it means for the case as a whole. The lizard man phenomenon was kicked off in the 1980s, specifically in the late 1980s, even more specifically in the summer of 1988. Sometime between July 14th and June 30th, Chris Davis had reported to the Lee County Sheriff Department that he had witnessed a large bipedal animal just outside of Scape Ore Swamp. Chris Davis, who was 17 at the time, described the creature he witnessed as quote-unquote green, wet-like, about 7 feet tall and had 3 fingers, red eyes, skin like a lizard, snake-like scales. Davis had allegedly seen this creature when he got a flat tire driving along the road not too far from Scape Ore Swamp, when the creature emerged from the wilderness, again allegedly, just as he was finishing up replacing the tire. Davis claims he was able to get into the car and begin to drive, but not before the creature was actually on top of the car, attempting pretty aggressively to get in. Eventually, the force of the car suddenly braking while Chris was driving supposedly threw the animal off the car and allowed Davis to escape to safety. Famously, Chris Davis was asked by Liston Truesdale, who was the sheriff of Lee County at the time, to draw the creature he had witnessed. According to Truesdale, Davis pretty instantly was able to draw what he saw. It was no professional art, but it was enough to convince the sheriff that whatever Chris Davis had seen, he had seen. For most people, this is kind of where Chris Davis's story ends. As mentioned before, Chris Davis did die 11 years ago in a shooting in 2009, ironically close to the anniversary of his alleged sighting. However, what came before Chris Davis's report is just as important as what came after it. Chris Davis's report is not necessarily unique because other people have allegedly witnessed the lizard man at Bishopville and described very similar experiences to Chris Davis. What is important about Chris Davis's testimony is the circumstances in which this particular kind of testimony arose. In the immediate days before Christopher Davis made his report, there was, on July 14th, a report of a torn-up car somewhere along the road near Scape Ore Swamp. This was not an abandoned car. Someone had indeed reported that it was their car, but the attacker was unknown. Again, making Chris Davis's report not exceedingly unique in that fashion. What's interesting about this is that Christopher Davis's encounter allegedly occurred weeks before this incident was reported, but he only reported his encounter a few days after this report was made. Many point to this, and perhaps rightfully, and considerably logically assume, well, that is a good indication that Christopher Davis was riding off the coattails of what he recognized could become a popular urban legend. And that entirely could be the case. And in most circumstances, that is the most likely option. However, stretching back further in time than just the immediate circumstances before Christopher Davis made his report is really what makes Christopher Davis's testimony very noteworthy. Christopher Davis was 17 when he reported his encounter to Liston Truesdale. Liston Truesdale, even at that point in time, was an older white gentleman who had, obviously, being in the sheriff's department, a position of legal authority in that small southern town. Chris Davis was a teenager who was an African-American male growing up in that same small southern community in the 1980s. It was only 20 years before that riots, protests, and harrowing conflicts regarding the racial treatment of African Americans in the country Chris Davis lived in were happening on the regular. Now, 20 years seems like a long time. In reality, though, it's not a very long time. 20 years can happen several times over the course of one's life. It certainly did at that rate for Liston Truesdale. It wasn't very long before or after Chris Davis made his reports that several other very borderline indescribable tragedies regarding the racial treatment of African Americans in the United States were taking place again, such as 145 fires being set to black churches around the South closer to 10 years after Chris Davis's report. In larger communities, when large societal change happens, it tends to be monitored more, especially when it's legal action taking place like it was after the 1960s. In smaller communities where there is less federal jurisdiction, change is in a strange way even more gradual. All effective change tends to be gradual. But the speed at which that gradient occurs can change depending on population size, because the attentiveness will change depending on population size. Chris Davis was growing up in an area that had a very low population size, very low level of attentiveness, so very likely, just historically, had a very slow gradients for acceptance and proper treatment of who Chris Davis was. And on top of all of this, he's a teenager. Liston Truesdale, again, was an older white gentleman who had been in authority for a while and who was still in authority at that point. That isn't speaking to Liston Truesdale's character, but the situation gave Chris Davis every right, every single reason imaginable to not lie. A kid reporting something like Chris Davis's alleged lizard man encounter is crazy enough in the first place. But being in a community where you specifically are not only less likely to be listened to, but you're more likely to be harshly punished, at least socially, if you say something as seemingly far out there as Chris Davis said. And still he walked over to that sheriff's department after that report came out and said he wanted to tell this story. We may never know what it was that Christopher Davis saw on June 30th, 1988. The evidence, though, seems to point to one thing that we perhaps can definitely say. Perhaps what we can definitely say is that Chris Davis was convinced he had seen something. He was convinced he had seen a lizard man. This is a very interesting and perhaps even unsettling set of circumstances. But sometimes those are the circumstances that hold the most intriguing factors. And I would love to know what all of you think about this case in particular. That being said, until next time.